And when I first started, fresh out of graduate school, over 4 decades ago, I was working with a group of young women who were incest survivors. And, if you just imagine, that work was extraordinary, very difficult, and also really taught me the basics of everything I'm going to share with you today. When I worked with these women and shared their stories, I realized very quickly that the traditional model that I was being taught in terms of the hospital setting that I worked in, the kind of pathologizing DSM model, wasn't matching my experience of being with these women at all. The model was really, people were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. These women were seen as being manipulative, particularly around self-harming behaviors that most of them were engaged in, that became addictions in order to survive. But back then, and even now, to a large extent, although people like Janina Fisher and Bessel van der Kolk, a lot of trauma people, Judith Herman, were really getting out there this message that we need to reframe how we understand self-harming and addictive behaviors. And the way I grew to understand them was through the lens of the autonomic nervous system, hence my attraction to Steve Porges' work and polyvagal theory. But we'll get there. So here I am trying to help these young women. I look around and I find some really interesting research in the feminist therapist world. And a wonderful book that came out back then with Laura Davis and Ellen Bass called The Courage to Heal, 1988. Still a fantastic book. If you're doing this work, I highly recommend it, even if you're not. It helps us to really understand, with what I call non-pathologizing ears, what the nature of self-harm and addiction and other trauma responses like dissociation really is. So Laura Bass and Ellen Davis write, the problem survivors experience with their bodies, splitting and numbing addictions, began as attempts to survive. This is polyvagal language. We understand these behaviors as the body's way of attempting to survive something that is unbearable. This work really is a call to action. If there was ever a time when those of us working in the mental health professions are needed, it's now. We're all feeling it in our bodies. Some of us shut down. Some of us get overactivated. It's very difficult to be grounded in a time like this in the world where horrendous things are happening. And I don't know about you, but I find that in my body, I'm really going up and down between feeling the intensity of what's happening and then needing breaks and looking for moments of gratitude, like you started with today, Nika. These moments, little instances where we can feel into something that feels nurturing. And we're going to do some of that today. So in this model, we have a new way of understanding trauma and addiction responses. It shifts the paradigm when you start to understand what's happening from the body. So this is a bottom-up, top-down model. It includes top-down, but we're working really from a very embodied perspective. We're looking to understand how the wisdom of the body plays out in behaviors that seem just plain self-destructive, but really, given the context in which they occur, was to survive. So out of this experience, I came up with a definition of addiction that's very simple and very helpful for clients who are struggling to try to figure out where they're at, and for therapists too, who are trying to navigate through this field. So my definition is simply something that helps you in the short term, it hurts you in the long term, and you can't stop doing it. So you may be able to stop for periods of time, but binging means that you come back to it again. So this paradigm shift comes from understanding that there's something about what happens in the body that it brings relief in addictive behaviors and dissociation. The most obvious one that we can think of is, say, with alcohol. So, for example, you have an argument with your boss. You shift into a sympathetic response in the nervous system of flight, fight. We're familiar with that place. Maybe you feel that anxious, oh boy, I got mad at my boss and now I'm going to get fired. You go home and you drink a bottle of wine. Your nervous system shifts from a flight, fight state into a shutting down, what Steve Porges named as a dorsal state in the nervous system, the numb place. And this brings relief. And when there's no other way to achieve that kind of relief, when you are positioned in the world, either because something has happened that was an episode that was traumatic, or your whole life has been in a trauma zone, say growing up in a marginalized community, your body gets wired into these trauma feedback loops. And shifting into a numb state brings the only relief that your body is picking up that's available to you if you don't have enough safety in your life to find other ways. It's an unconscious process. We don't think about it very much. The body takes us into these trauma feedback loops, and addictions function as ways of shifting us back and forth. Now, the alcohol one is fairly easy to understand. Something like cutting is more complex, and we'll get into that and see how that functions by, in cutting, releasing endogenous opioids. So opioids that are in your body already that create a kind of numbing state in the body that shifts us down into the dorsal branch and brings relief. Who knew? Well, the women in my group, they knew that that behavior of cutting brought relief, but they couldn't explain how. And so that became my quest, was to try to figure that out. So when we understand the body from the polyvagal lens, we see that there's this shift in paradigms into understanding that behaviors we've named as maladaptive are actually adaptive ways of surviving in maladaptive environments. So we turn it upside down. So the Felt-Sense polyvagal model is an anti-oppressive lens. We know that there is a deep kind of trauma that's embodied, that is carried through generations and impacts people profoundly. Racism and misogyny, poverty is a huge factor and becoming more and more a factor in the world. Certainly in Canada these days, very noticeable. Hypermasculinity. Feeling as though we have to solve everything on our own, and that this is kind of a independent state and a way of being. And of course, what we know is that we really need each other. We function when we're in relationship together. So a lot of people who are trauma therapists will tell me that they don't work with addiction. And I'm really on a mission to try to change that. If you work with trauma, you almost always work with addiction, because this is the only way that bodies can survive unbearable experiences.